If you've ever wondered what my day job has to do with content on this channel,
So I want to tell you a story about how what happens here in this ecology is related to English Premier League soccer.
then this is the episode for you.
What?
The racists are going to hate this. Hi, and welcome back to the channel. So when I talk about controversial issues on this channel, one of the most common things that I get from people who just want to be mean are mocking the fact that I'm a college professor, either by expressing doubt about that fact or talking about how me being a professor doesn't qualify me to talk about what I talk about on this channel. But despite the haters, I wanted to show you this talk that I recently gave at the Writer Center at Florida State University, because I think it has a lot to do with the overarching subjects that I cover on this platform. So the Writer Center is a joint center actually between Florida State University and Florida A&M University, a historically black college. Some say it's not as good as Morehouse, but you know, that's a debate for another time. I was asked to speak at this summit on food resiliency in the face of disaster because of the professional work that I do, both in my teaching and my research. But what I think makes this opportunity unique is the fact that so much of what I talked about is reflected in my personal life and the videos that I post on this channel. So I thought it might be a good opportunity to share that with you all. And so the main theme of this talk is how everything that we do as human beings is rooted in story, the stories that we accept as part of our identity, and how we as people who want to solve our ecological, environmental, and social problems have to turn a critical lens on the stories that we tell each other and the stories that we accept, the stories that we're socialized to believe, in order for us to come up with new solutions to these problems. Because what we've been doing thus far for the last half millennia, it's not really working and making things worse. So I put chapter titles below so that you can skip around in case you wanted to focus in on one particular topic that I cover. But I encourage you to watch the whole thing, including the Q&A afterwards, because there's a lot of really good information and details. And the story of this talk makes the most sense when you view it in its entirety. Let's head on down to Tallahassee and see what I have to talk about.
So that brings me to our morning keynote speaker. We're very pleased to welcome Jonathan Hall, who's a biology professor, wildlife ecologist, wild food content creator, and outdoor enthusiast based in Southeast Michigan. Jonathan earned his bachelor's degree in biology from Morehouse College, great university, and went on to become the first African American to earn a PhD in ecology from The Ohio State University. And his research is taking him from India, which our friend John Matthias did very amazing field work in India himself, from India to Appalachia and California, where Jonathan studied endangered and threatened species and the human cultures that interacted with them. Dr. Hall is an associate professor of biology at Eastern Michigan University, where he teaches and conducts research focused on decolonial ecologies, and his work brings together ecology, culture, and lived experience, and offers an important lens for today's conversations about food systems, access, and resilience during times of disruption. Later today, we'll also hear a luncheon keynote from Asla Aslan, Director of Institute for Water and Health, a little closer to us at Georgia Southern University, wonderful university that I've actually visited, whose work focuses on water quality, public health, and protecting vulnerable communities during emergencies and national disasters. We're very grateful Asla is here, and we're very grateful that Jonathan is here. As we begin today's program, let me just close by saying Florida State sees its role not just as a research institution, but as a partner, one that listens, learns, and works alongside our communities to turn knowledge into meaningful action. And therefore, the summit reflects that responsibility and what becomes possible when farmers, nutritionists, researchers, and communities come together with a shared purpose. So finally, I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you for the work you do every day. And please join me now in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Hall.
always get nervous of like coming on stage and like, don't trip, don't fall. All right, it's going to take me just a second to switch my computer over. I maybe cause a little bit of issue because I would been making changes to my talk since I've been here and in conversation with people, as I like tend to do, to edit things. But yes, we're here. Okay, so I can get started right away. All right, so I'm going to talk about wildlife ecology along the Gulf Coast, and really not talk too much about the Gulf Coast itself, because my experience here as a researcher is not that extensive, but I do have family ties, as I'll talk about, and had some Gulf experiences. But what I really want to do is talk about stories and the importance of stories as us as a human species, and how that shapes the way that we understand things like disruption, disasters, resilience, and those sorts of things. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we are in February, the shortest month of the year. Not upset about that, but it is Black History Month, and it is the 100th anniversary of Black History Month. And so I think it's important because the United States of America does not make sense. It's not legible without Black folks. It's not legible without understanding our history, which is not something wholly separate from American history. It's inextricably linked to American history. And so I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that, and that so much of what I'm going to talk about today is shaped with what we would categorize as Black history, but really it is American history. Really, it is the history of our species on this planet. All right, so human beings are storytelling animals. Everything we do has a story behind it. Nobody ever heard the phrase, "Ooh, I have a really good story for you." And then people say, "I don't want to hear that," right? Everything that we do has a story, whether it's politics, whether it's sports, whether it's whatever we're doing. There's a story behind the reason why we do the things that we do. And it's important for us to recognize that stories can be incomplete, and our actions that are guided by those stories can go certain ways based on the things that we know. So I've showed you several pictures here that have to do with a story or several stories in the Gulf. And you may be wondering, seeing a photo and saying, what's the story there, right? So I don't have time to tell the stories that are here, but as you can see, it involves fish, which is something I love to eat. It involves a little bit of pain. It involves something delicious, and it involves my father, who wanted to be here, but he had a stroke 2.5 weeks ago. And it was fortunately a mild stroke, but I just need to shout him out. Another reason why is because my father's patrilineal family is from Lloyd, from Leon County, from Jefferson County. They are the Halls. My last name is Hall. Lake Hall is a place you might know of. I just found out, well, I'll get to that story, something I just found out at the end of my talk. But if you wanted to read about what these stories were, I will tell you where to go. I have like a newsletter. I mentioned in my bio that I'm a wild food content creator, so I have a weekly newsletter, and I also have a YouTube channel where some of these stories play out. Hey folks, I just wanted to take a break and let you know that one of the best ways to get the most out of the content on this channel is to subscribe to my newsletter. Every Sunday, I give you more depth and insight into the topics I cover on Out There JCH, including thoughts and perspectives that I don't really share on this platform. The newsletter is free to sign up, and as an incentive to becoming a subscriber, I'm offering a free wild food resource guide that will help make you a more capable harvester and home cook. Just click the link in the description to sign up. Okay, let's get back to the episode. But yes, red snapper, and this took place in Mobile, Alabama. So yeah, that's a really interesting set of stories. So my story, in terms of what led me along this path that brings me here to you today to talk about the things in my experiences, began with this program. nature on PBS. It was one of the favorite things that I did. We would have Sunday dinner, me and my parents, and I would watch nature and just be enthralled by the different animals that were out there. And I needed to know more about that. I needed to go to those places. I needed to see those animals because they were just so interesting. This is a picture of me and my mother. And so my mother is a high school biology teacher, retired, and a high school counselor. But one of the most formative stories in my career was my mother bringing home a surplus fetal pig that she was working with her students in class and bringing it home, and us dissecting that fetal pig on the kitchen table, much to my father's delight, and just, again, being fascinated by animals. And so I went on to Morehouse College. This is a photo of my college roommate and I last year at our freshman dorm on Morehouse's campus, and the incredible stories and formative education that I received, but also the informal education that I received at a historically Black college, and understanding the importance of these institutions in being able to create opportunities and train young Black folks in ways that we could go out and do amazing things. And so after graduating from Morehouse, I went to Ohio State University, where I did my dissertation research in Rajasthan, India, because I heard an incredible story about a woman and her daughters that are depicted here. It's a woman by the name of Amrita Devi, and she belonged to a caste called the Bishnoi people. Bishnoi translates to 29 from Hindi to English. And the Bishnoi people have a long-standing tradition of protecting wildlife and tree species with their lives. And this mural in Bikaner, Rajasthan, depicts the sacrifice of Amrita Devi and her daughters protecting a tree species, which just so happens to be central to the ecology of Rajasthan, the farming ecology and the wildlife ecology of the area, with their lives. They challenged the Maharaja's men and said, if you're going to cut down this tree, you're going to have to cut me down with it. And of course they did, because, economically challenged, and especially women, did not have political agency. They were expendable, right? And so it was decided amongst the Bishnoi people that for every tree that was cut down, someone would kill themselves in protest. And it took 363 Bishnoi. And if you talk to other folks in the area, they will say that, oh, well, it wasn't just the Bishnoi, it was us as well, which is an interesting part of the story. But in the end, it took 363 individuals to kill themselves in protest in order to put enough political pressure on the Maharaja of the region to stop the cutting of these important trees. And so that brings me to the story of my research, where I was studying the impact of the presence of Bishnoi people in this region. And there's a really interesting ecology of Rajasthan that involves the processing of these animal carcasses. So these are carcasses of cattle and other livestock, which the majority of the population do not consume themselves. And so these animals are brought to a dumping ground where vultures, scavenging birds, do a very excellent job of cleaning up those carcasses. But the story gets a little bit challenging, because around the late 80s, early 90s, there was a veterinary drug that was introduced that just so happens to be metabolically impossible for the vultures to process. And so if they eat livestock that had been inoculated with this cheap and available drug that was important for pastoralists to keep their animals healthy, the vultures die. And when the vultures die, there's still all this food available. And so what animal takes the place of the vultures? These cute puppies that then grow up to be dogs. And so during my dissertation, there's a really interesting story, again, that you can read about the time I was hunted by feral dogs when I was doing my transects. So I'm still here, but at the time, I wasn't sure whether or not I would be. But what's interesting about this story is that this the unintended consequences of making a veterinary drug available to people had these long-term and wide-ranging effects. And a recent paper that was published suggested that 500,000 people lost their lives because the ecological relationship between livestock, vultures, and human beings was disrupted. And so feral dog populations exploded when the vulture populations crashed. And with the explosion of feral dog populations, you get an explosion in cases of rabies in human beings. Okay? Because dogs are not as efficient at cleaning up carcasses as vultures. And all we have to do is look at the face of a vulture, or in this case, a condor, which was the next sort of pivot in my career in understanding these relationships and understanding the whole story of how environments are impacted by human relationships with animals. And so this is one of the most critically endangered species on the planet, the California condor. It's the largest flying bird in North America. And their populations are not threatened by a veterinary drug, but are threatened by lead. And specifically, the lead that human beings in this nation use to hunt. And so vultures, as is their role ecologically, they clean up what's left behind. And if you're a hunter, which I ended up being once I moved to West Virginia, you harvest an animal and you leave parts of that animal in the field, and those vultures come and clean it up. But if you use lead ammunition, fragments of that lead ammunition remain in the carcass, and they end up in condors. So condor populations have crashed because of the human use of lead. And so this research is really interesting and impactful, but the story of what I was doing here, was published in journals, and I'm sure you all have read those journals, right? Because we all have unfettered access to research that's made available, being sarcastic, of course. But what's interesting about this story is that the biggest response that I got from this research happened when I was invited to be on the Ologies podcast, which is the #1 science podcast in the United States of America. And I could not believe how many interactions and other opportunities have come from me telling this story on this platform. And I want to mention this because it's important that folks in the room, and we are at an academic institution, and sometimes we can get sort of caught up in making an impact within these walls. But the way that our work, and many of you all who work outside of academia understand this, is that the impact comes when you're able to bring these stories, bring this research to the people. And the mechanisms to do that in academia are not always as direct and as impactful. So it's really important that if we're doing work that is important, that we are engaging with people outside of these walls, outside of this institution, because that's where the impact really starts to pick up. Okay? So the Ologies podcast ended up being a really, really important part of understanding my work. Now, I'd be remiss being at Florida State University if I didn't talk about this individual, because growing up, he was my hero. So I still am kind of a football nut. And if those of you all who don't know, this is Charlie Ward. He was a quarterback for the Florida State Seminoles when I was a young person, and he was my hero. Okay? In large part because I didn't see black people playing quarterback position. It's a very important position in the game of football, and Charlie Ward could do no wrong. He won the Heisman Trophy. He was a big deal, and I was so excited. I hoped that he was going to get drafted by the 49ers, my favorite team at the time. But he ended up doing something different that shocked me. He ended up playing professional basketball. And I was so disappointed because I was ready to see Charlie Ward play in the NFL and continue his career and continue to be my hero, and I wasn't as big a fan of basketball. But the reason why Charlie Ward decided to go to the NBA was not just because the NBA had guaranteed contracts and the NFL does not, but because every prospect, when they get ready to go to the pros, gets sort of like a projection on how well or how high they might be drafted, right? It's sort of like a prediction of your value to the league. And the league did not value Charlie Ward because he was a quarterback. who was black, a quarter black. Okay? And we know this because of this individual, Warren Moon, who was a fantastic college quarterback who preceded Charlie Ward. And when time came for him to be drafted to the NFL, he refused to change his position. And so in order to play professional football, he had to go to Canada. And so in my worship of Charlie Ward as a hero, I learned that the story of this sport that I loved had an unpleasant, complex portion to it that I needed to understand. And if we think that these things are in the past, you may not have known that the NFL, as recently as 5 years ago, used to have an incredibly racist policy for compensating players who were seeking damages for CTE. And they had this policy called race norming, which essentially ended up causing the NFL to pay black players less money for cognitive decline based on the racist idea that black players started out at a lower baseline cognitive ability. And so the amount of money that the NFL would pay you for CTE was based on how much cognitive ability you lost. But if you were black, you lost less because you started out with less cognitive ability. This policy ended in 2021. So this is an unpleasant part of this industry. And I had to learn all of this as a child. And when this book came out by William Roden, brilliant journalist, $40 Million Slaves, as you might imagine, it was well received. It wasn't. Okay. This idea that, oh, well, they're getting paid really well. And I watched, as a graduate student, as an undergraduate student, this conversation on black athletes be very contentious. Right? But it's an important part of the story. And just because the story is unpleasant doesn't mean that we ignore it, because it puts things into the correct context. And I'd be remiss if I didn't shout out fellow Morehouse grad and contemporary Robert Bennett III, whose book will come out this March, talking about the story behind the athletes, the way that black athletes have shaped American politics, not just sports, but American politics. So go pick up his book when it comes out. All right, so getting back to food and wild food, this is the YouTube episode from my experience in fishing in the Gulf of Mexico, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. I want to talk about what's happening in this photo. And this is a photo taken in the beaches in Texas of a massive fish die-off that happens in the Gulf of Mexico regularly. And this idea of, well, why does that happen? So I want to tell you a story about how what happens here in this region, in this ecology, is related to English Premier League soccer. What? It relates, okay? Follow me. So, Gulf of Mexico, these lands that drain into this ecology are these states here. And this region was not always controlled by what's now the United States of America. It was controlled and lived on and by indigenous people. But the story of indigenous people in this region, of course, involves this story, which is a depiction of one of the many forced expulsions. This one we call the Trail of Tears, the painting of the Trail of Tears. But there were many events in the United States history of this new nation being built on the genocide and removal of indigenous people. Okay? And interestingly enough about this story is that the Cherokee people challenged land rights of the United States all the way to the Supreme Court and won their case. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Cherokee people and said to President Andrew Jackson, you have to stop letting people squat on these lands and take over these lands. And the famous line from Andrew Jackson is, and I'm paraphrasing, Chief Justice John Marshall has ruled, now let him come down here and enforce it. So the President of the United States decided that one branch of government, one that was supposed to be a check and a balance, was invalid, which Can't imagine that ever happening again in U.S. history. Okay? But once you remove the people who control these lands and are interacting in these environments in a particular way, that then makes way for the thing that you wanted to do in the first place, okay? Which is, we all know, cotton. And there are two maps here. The top map is a density map in 1860 of the enslaved population in this same region. And the dot map below that is cotton production. And so before you decide to employ this cash crop that's going to make you money hand over fist, you need to remove the people that are there that are not practicing this particular relationship with the land, and then you need to bring in labor that you don't pay because your profit margins need to be high, right? And so this practice went on through enslavement, through sharecropping, and I show this photo here to remind everyone of the unpleasant story that this was a industry that involved Black folks of all ages. I remember visiting my Aunt Carrie in Alabama on her farm that she sharecropped, okay, as a kid. And she was part of this legacy. And so when we talk about these stories as being far in the past, no, they're not. We can all put hands on people and talk to people who were there for these events. And it's important to understand and remember those stories, which are things that happen all the time with Black folks. But it's whether or not these stories make it out into the broader community so that we can understand ourselves, our collective identities in this world. So cotton is grown, massive amounts of cotton are grown, and some of it is processed in the northern part of the United States, but a lot of it is shipped overseas. And this is a painting of a cotton processing factory in the UK. See where I'm going with this? And they sent this cotton to one city in the UK, and they called that city Cottonopolis because the British were brokering cotton that was grown in the United States. And the Brits love to talk about how they outlawed slavery way before the United States, but they were very happy to process and sell the cotton that was grown with slave labor. Now, if you've never heard of Cottonopolis as being a city in Britain, that's understandable because they changed the name to Manchester City. Manchester City used to be the hub of where cotton was grown. And as you might imagine, there are lots of people who made not lots of people, but very few people who made lots of money off of selling cotton. And so where does that money go? That money goes to a football club that would need to pay the world's best players so they could win championships. And so the wealth that Manchester City Football Club has comes from the money that they made brokering the world's cotton from the United States. So we're almost done with that story. So what does that have to do with fish die-offs? Well, as I mentioned, if you're transforming the ecology of this region that was wetland and forest to then grow cotton, you have to cut down a lot of trees, you have to establish farms, but you're changing the way that the landscape functions. It's a very wet region, it rains, there's a lot of runoff, and now you removed members of this ecological community that hold soil on the landscape to grow cotton. And cotton is a very nutrient-intensive crop. You have to put nutrients in the soil, and if you're losing lots of soil every year because you don't have the ecology that's there, you have to put nutrients in the soil. Those nutrients are washed out into the Gulf of Mexico, where photosynthetic organisms are like, oh, it's a party. There's all these nutrients available. So their populations explode into what we understand now as algal blooms. So the reason why we have algal blooms in the Gulf of Mexico, and the reason why we have algal blooms in my home state, well, now my home state, Michigan and the Great Lakes region, is because of farming practices. Those farming practices were put in place in order to boost the American economy. And when you have algal blooms, you have a lot less oxygen available for larger organisms, and you get fish die-offs. So one of the things that I didn't understand in my formal education, even at the PhD level, was why these things were happening. Like, I understood that there were more nutrients. I understood the mechanics of that, but why was this now an issue when it didn't used to be? And we can't talk about this without talking about the history of white supremacy in this country, because the whole reason to grow cotton and expel indigenous people and enslaved black folks was because of the idea that folks who were white had the right to do with the land whatever they wanted. And we're still living with that legacy today, right? There are times of the year where you can't go swimming and it's unadvisable to go fishing in the Gulf of Mexico. It's because of this. And that's more of the whole story. And so I want to give recommendations of books that people can read to understand these regions. And these are 3 books that are really important. A geographer by the name of Clyde Woods, who's unfortunately no longer with us, has written really important books on understanding both the Mississippi Delta and New Orleans, and these long histories that tell a more complete story of what's going on in these regions is really important. Another book by Tiffany Lethabo King about the relationship between Black and Indigenous folks in shaping this region as well. These books weren't assigned to me for my PhD in ecology. I had to read these on my own, right? I had to seek out these stories because I was in community with people who are learning about these things. So it's important for us to understand this history because, again, what's happening doesn't really make sense without more of the story. Okay. So talking about my relationship with ecology that lives outside of academia, I love fish. I grew up fishing, okay? And it was a really important, and it remains a really important part of my life. It is an appreciation that I'm passing on to my kids. My daughter loves to eat fish, but she's not all that into fishing. My son is very much into fishing. And this is a photo that I took in Traverse Bay in northern Michigan. And it was a really special event because it was the first time that there were 3 generations of Halls on a fishing boat. And my father, who turns 84 in March, still talks about this. This was last year, about this being such an important event for him and completing that story. And so I continue to fish and understand that as part of my life. But when I moved to West Virginia, and I was really excited to hear the provost talk about his experiences in West Virginia, didn't know that. That was also a really formative event and time in my life because I also met Dr. Ustan and Dr. Thompson there. We continue our friendship and relationship today. But I got into hunting because I had venison for the first time, and I was like, I need to have more of this in my life. And I love to cook, and I'm just really interested in being part of that process from the field all the way to the plate. And while in West Virginia, I got connected with these 2 individuals, Mike Costello and Amy Thompson, who run a business, Appalachian Food Heritage, their Lost Creek Farm. And they were really important in my life in understanding the whole story of food. And so they make amazing food, but what their food is grounded in is the stories of the people who created the food. And it's amazing how much better food tastes when you understand what it took to get that food to your plate, whether or not you're participating in it directly, but also the people who contributed to the recipes and the understanding. You gain an appreciation for those things. And because I was in relationship with these folks, I got to meet another person who I idolized as a young person, Anthony Bourdain. So that's the late Anthony Bourdain, and I am sitting next to him. And yes, I am drinking hard cider because I am so nervous that I'm sitting next to this person who changed the way that I thought about food. And had I read his book, Kitchen Confidential, when it came out when I was 18 years old, I probably wouldn't be here because I would have become a chef. It was that important. But, this was a really awesome experience because it brings food into focus. It tells the more complete story of food, and instead of just like, oh, this is a delicious meal, what's behind it? And from this opportunity, I got to write about my experiences becoming a hunter. So I wrote this piece for the show called Hunting While Black. And what was it like to be an adult onset hunter, right? Because there's lots of people who grew up hunting, lots of black folks who grew up hunting, but that wasn't me, right? I wasn't allowed to interact with firearms as a young person growing up in the suburbs of Maryland. My mother was very clear that you as a young black boy will have nothing to do with guns because it's too dangerous. It's not something you can afford to play with. So it wasn't until an adult that I learned how to hunt. And so I wrote about this experience about, like, what is it like to not grow up hunting and be black and learn how to hunt in one of the whitest states in the country, in West Virginia. And it ended up being a very good experience sort of overall, although, as we know, that firearms in this country is a very contentious thing, and especially if you're a black person, right? But writing about these experiences, I drew from the work of Carolyn Finney, who wrote the book Black Faces, White Spaces, which was an incredibly formative work for me. And it spoke to my experience as a black person who was interested in the outdoors and ecology and what that was like, and not seeing myself. As it mentioned in my bio, I'm the first African-American to earn a PhD in ecology from Ohio State University. And I don't say that because, like, ooh, look at me. I say that because it's 2011, and we know black people are close to the land. We know black people have a deep understanding of the land. That's part of the reason why many of our ancestors were brought from the continent of Africa, not because we had strong backs and were good workers, but because we had knowledge of the land. But it wasn't until works like Carolyn Finney's and and Drew Lanham, who wrote a book, The Home Place, about these black folks who always felt rooted in the environment, but didn't see themselves represented, and so they had to tell their stories. And because they told their stories, I was able to tell my story. I was able to feel more comfortable in these spaces. In 2011, there were only 3 African Americans who earned PhDs in ecology in the entire country. I was one of them, and I tweeted that out once when I was on Twitter. I will never call it X. And one of the other 3 contacted me. It's like, I think I'm one of the other ones. We still haven't found the third one yet. Well, we're still looking, right? And so it's important to see ourselves represented, and we've been talking about representation and how important it is, and the fact that all of us are standing on the shoulders of people who've made space for their stories so that we could achieve, so that we could push the envelope and tell stories. And so hunting has been a really interesting experience that's also led me to do research, because as I was hunting and learning these things, I was like, wait a minute. So I'm talking to people about hunting, I'm talking to people about their experiences, and you know, I keep hearing about food deserts and food scarcity and these sorts of things, but when I talk to rural people in the state of West Virginia, many of them, hunting is like part of their work. But when I looked at the food research, it wasn't being captured. Like, where's all the venison and the fish and the foraging? I don't see that in this work. And so, it was an opportunity, a research opportunity. So this is a paper that I published with students, one of whom, Heidi Gum, is from Central West Virginia, grew up hunting. And we simply asked the questions, how much venison is coming off the landscape every year in West Virginia and in the region? And it turns out it's a lot. Okay, we estimated that every year 8 million pounds of venison are harvested annually, which is one of the lower harvest amounts for the state or for the region. And so you may have trouble sort of like, what does 8 million pounds of venison look like? Like, how does that translate? The average American eats about 100 pounds of red meat every year. So 8 million pounds would feed 80,000 people for an entire year. And this is the amount of food that's coming off the landscape that's not being captured in the food-raised research. We talk about deserts, food deserts, and lack of opportunity, and rural folks not having access to food, but they do have access to, many of them do have access to food and access that food. So how do we capture that? I don't know what the capacity is of Doak Walker Stadium. Is it 80,000? Okay. It's about that. Okay, so that's a lot of people that could eat, free range, hopefully cruelty free, antibiotic free red meat every year that's coming off the landscape that we're just not talking about. And in speaking of disturbance and resilience, we then ask the question, do we observe more deer harvest over the COVID pandemic, the onset of the COVID pandemic? And so these two graphs represent the 6 states that were part of our research, and then looking at the harvest rate of deer for each of these states during the 2020 hunting season compared to the previous season, and then compared to the 5-year average. Now, not every state saw an increase in the amount of deer harvested, but Pennsylvania and Ohio certainly did. You might say, well, maybe people are, just bored, or, they're outdoors. They can't go to their usual places to socialize and things like that. But we specifically saw a dramatic increase in the number of antlerless deer that were harvested. So if you hunt for fun, if you hunt for a trophy, you're hunting bucks, you're hunting the big racks. But if you're hunting antlerless deer, it's to put food in your freezer. And so again, in the food-raised research, we talk about the infrastructure of people's access to food being really important, and it is. But there is a different system that people are accessing that, again, was not being captured in the research on food resilience and responses to disasters. But there's a long tradition of people where food is the central is the focal point of resistance, of survival, of activism. And all we have to do is look at Fannie Lou Hamer, who understood that people in her region, in Mississippi, needed food independence in order to have these larger political fights and to survive. And so her story is incredible. Her leadership in the civil rights movement, and making sure that people are fed, and that was the way to freedom and independence. George Washington Carver. I don't know if you all know this story. I found this incredible, and I learned this story about George Washington Carver. Brilliant scientist, incredible mind, incredible inventor in Monica White's book, Freedom Farmers. And this is wild. So George Washington Carver worked at Tuskegee University his entire professional career. Okay? But at one point, after he had built a reputation, a very prominent inventor by the name of Thomas Edison, I don't know if you all have heard of him, offered George Washington Carver a job to work in his labs because he recognized how brilliant this person was. And he offered George Washington Carver a salary of $100,000 in the 1920s. Which would be worth about $3.5 million today. And George Washington Carver turned him down and said, no, my work is here with the people. And I can guarantee you Tuskegee University was not paying George Washington Carver $100,000. So think about what that would mean, about the choice that you would have to make as a black man in that time to turn down $3.5 million a year and all the good that you could do with that money, presumably, right? That economic opportunity. Not to mention the prestige of working for Thomas Edison. But George Washington Carver said, no, my work is here. It's important. And so when we think about extension centers and how important they are for the work that universities do in interacting with the community, that starts with George Washington Carver. He started the Tuskegee University Mobile Extension Service. And so when we think about extension centers, when we think about the Locavore movement, eating local, George Washington Carver was the one at this institution going out to the people and showing them the things that he was learning in his lab about ways to grow food. But that's not part of the story that we talk about when we talk about the importance of extension centers at universities. It started with these folks. Okay? And it's important for people who are at academic institutions to stay connected with the community. So I'll end with this, and I know the title of my talk is Wildlife Ecology in the Gulf, but as I mentioned before, I don't have a ton of experience there. I can just tell my stories that are related to this. And because we are storytelling animals, I hope that what I've talked about today allows us to weave our stories together, because we have complex problems that need better answers than we have been able to provide and put to bear at our towards our problems now. And because stories are the motivating factor for what human beings do, we need to share our stories. We need to weave those stories together. We need to understand each other and be in community and relationship with each other to face these problems. So one of the things that I've loved about this conference so far and look forward to is to continue to learn from people who are rooted in these communities, who are rooted in the land, who are rooted in their relationships. Because we never know where their stories are going to go. So I'll end with this in saying that I mentioned that my father's family is from the region. This is a picture of the U.S. Census in Florida in 1870. And the name, highlighted in yellow, is Moses Hall Sr., who is my 3 times great-grandfather, who is rooted in this region. And so part of the other reason why I'm here is to sort of see where this story goes, to understand more about where my family comes from. And in sort of reviewing this information, I learned that the oldest school for African Americans in the state of Florida is called Lake Hall School. And right now, Lake Hall School, there's been a movement and a campaign to preserve this site. And so I hopped on Facebook and I found the Lake Hall School page and contacted the person who was leading this fight. And I'm going to meet them later on this week to go see this site and try to understand more of the story. But it's really important for not only the work that I do, but for understanding who I am and how my connections, my family connections to this region, can help shape stories that will hopefully make positive contributions. And that's a picture of me and my dad going fishing in Lake Michigan. And so I'm sad that my dad is not able to be here. I'm recording myself on that, and then I'm going to send him the video. So shout out to you, Pop. And it's important that we continue to engage with these stories and understanding all of who we are, and to not stop and just be satisfied with stories that we know are incomplete. And there's so much to gain. There is pain in a lot of these stories. There is discomfort in a lot of these stories. But at the end of the day, we gain a clearer picture of who we are and where we're going. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Yes, I mean, if you want to know why I was bleeding in that photo, like, I'm happy to tell that story. If you want to know more about what it was like to be chased by feral dogs while you're by yourself in the middle of a village in Rajasthan, I'm happy to tell those stories as well. And yeah, just looking forward to continuing to learn from everyone here. And I've already learned so much, so yeah, thank you. Yes, yes. I start from something that Carolyn Finney always says in her talks. Dr. Finney is fond of saying, all these lands were stolen, right? And I think that a path towards rehabilitating the land, which is really about rehabilitating ourselves and our relationship with the land, has to begin with centering the knowledge, practices, of the people who stewarded this land before this, the United States of America was even dreamed up and sort of took over this space. And so in the work that people do to restore these ecologies, if it's not centered around the expertise and the sovereignty of indigenous people, then I think that that's a path that ignores an essential part of the story. So I think that it's going to look different for different parts of the Gulf, right? Indigenous people were not all one people, right? And they had different interactions and different ways of interacting with the environment. And so I think it needs to start with centering indigenous folks, which means giving up power, right? Which means giving up power, which means giving up authority that the United States had no business taking, and the colonizers had no business taking in the first place, right? So it's sort of giving back something that never belonged to us, and seeing what relationships are possible at this sort of like later stage in history. Yeah, that's what I would say. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Divergent stories collide and perhaps yield revelatory truths.
Ooh. Divergent stories leading to revelatory truths. Oh my goodness, that's a good question. Okay, here's one. The story of Abraham Lincoln is one that we sort of generally feel as being really positive. And Abraham Lincoln is deeply tied to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. And if you know a little bit about that history, the largest federal mass execution ever in U.S. history was ordered by Abraham Lincoln in 1862. Where the United States was fighting a civil war between the North and the South, but they were also fighting to take indigenous land in what's now like the Midwest, Minnesota, and those areas. So the Lakota and Dakota people were resisting the fact that the United States had gone back on their agreement that if the Lakota and Dakota people ceded land to the United States, then the United States would provide supplies to sort of compensate them for that. And in order to break that rebellion, the fact that the Lakota and the Lakota people were upset about the United States going back on that deal, there was a back and forth between Abraham Lincoln and the militia in what's now Minnesota, requesting that they hang 300 people to break the rebellion. And Abraham Lincoln was like, I'm not really comfortable with that. How about 3? And they eventually settled on 38 individuals. Those 38 people were hanged and then thrown into an open grave. They were not given back to their people for proper burial rites. And the father of the Mayo brothers went to that open grave site, harvested several of the bodies, and then taught his sons anatomy with the bodies of indigenous people. And those brothers went on with their knowledge to found the Mayo Clinic, which is a really important institution in this country, right? If you get cancer in this country, it's one of like the top 3 places you want to go. So there's a complex history there. We think of Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator, and certainly the Emancipation Proclamation is really important, but we almost never talk about this other aspect of history. And so in terms of my own revelation in this was sort of like realizing that the narratives that we tell about the history of the United States are influenced by what we're comfortable teaching people. And it wasn't until I heard that story that then I dug a little bit deeper about Abraham Lincoln to understand that one of his proposals after emancipation was to send all Black folks back to Africa, Liberia, right? And I didn't know that because for most of my life, the narrative of who Abraham Lincoln was solidified. And so it wasn't until I interacted with indigenous scholars and sort of learned that history that helped with that revelation. And so then that helps motivate me talking about, well, wait a minute, there are other stories here that need to be understood. Another part of that story, which is disturbing, is that the skull of one of the men who was hanged in 1862 was on display at the Mayo Clinic until 1998. And the Dakota and Lakota people had been demanding the rematriation of the bodies of their individuals for a long time, but it wasn't until 1998 that his full body was returned, which also led to a revelation of, oh, there are a lot of bodies at academic institutions, and many of those bodies come from indigenous people and enslaved people. So those conflicting narratives. That's not to say that like I don't appreciate Abraham Lincoln's role in history, but we have to be honest about the whole history of that relationship. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, do you have any tips how to sign
Mm.
sort of connecting with the land, hunting capacity? What are some good ways to communicate the importance of that understanding without sort of overwhelming folks who may not be
Yeah, so one of the things, I'll answer that question concisely, challenge accepted. With something that I learned during my dissertation research, and part of it was like going into communities and talking to people. But the pace at which it happened was very different. And so I remember spending an entire trip and flying, halfway across the world. And for 2 weeks, the majority of what I did was go to people's offices and homes and drink chai. And, I had this agenda. I was like, oh, I need to get this information. I need to do all these things. But, I spent 3 weeks and all I did was like talk to people. And we didn't talk about research. They just wanted to know who I was and to ask me questions about who I was and for me to ask questions who they were. But that was essential work that was essential time that I spent to then be able to do the things that I've been able to do research-wise. So my advice in terms of building connection with people and communities and not wanting to overwhelm folks is to then sort of like slow the pace down in your own mind about how quickly things are going to get accomplished, because really nothing worthwhile gets accomplished without strong relationships. And building strong relationships and building trust takes time. And we are, I think, nervous about our problems that we're facing and them being immediate. But again, the solutions to those problems aren't going to happen without people. Like, human beings are all we have. We're not particularly strong animals. We're not particularly fast animals. Our senses are not great. But what our strength is our ability to cooperate and our ability to communicate abstract concepts, right? But in order to do that, it takes time. We think about like human beings, it takes us, about 2 years to learn how to speak any language. But once we can, the power we have in being able to communicate with each other is tremendous. And so I would say that, like, as best we can, because if we're in academia, we have to put food on the table. Like, this is our livelihood. So we are on a time clock, especially if we're on the tenure track, right? We have to get things done in a certain time. But if we can, as best we can, to slow that pace down and understand that nothing worthwhile is going to get accomplished unless we build relationships. And so you just got to spend time with people, not with the mindset of what am I going to get out of, what information am I going to be able to extract, but just like, I just need to spend time with you to get to know who you are, and they need to get to know, and you need to get to know who they are. Because I've had relationships in the field where I was like, oh, I can't work with this person, right? But if I was rushing to sort of like get the information, I might bypass the fact that this person is not trustworthy, right? Or this person is trying to take advantage of me. And they need to know that too, right? So I think that it's difficult given the structure that we're in and the way that we're socialized to get stuff done to do that. But as best we can, we need to slow down and just build relationships. Get to know somebody to really decide whether or not this relationship is worthwhile, and more so from people who are outside these big institutions, to determine whether or not they can trust you, because there's so many of us that they cannot trust and should not trust because we don't have their interests in heart. But it takes time to sort of understand that. Yeah.
So let's give Dr.
Thank you.
Holt a round of applause.
So believe it or not, this was my first ever keynote address. And I can tell you that I was really nervous to give this talk. I think it went okay, but I want to hear from you. How do you think I did? I hope you enjoyed this glimpse into my day job, and I hope that it gave you a little bit more insight into what motivates me to post the content on this channel, in my newsletter, and just generally how I move through the world. Okay, so YouTube is going to recommend some content for you, but if you are curious about the story behind my bloody finger and fishing in the Gulf, then you're going to want to check out that video right here. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on